Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
Have you ever wondered if our very instincts, those survival mechanisms that got us here, might actually be our biggest threat? Today, we're diving into this fascinating paradox with Kristian Rönn, a brilliant mind who's not only the CEO and co-founder of Normative, the world's first carbon accounting engine, but also a thought leader whose work spans climate policy, philosophy, and artificial intelligence. Before founding Normative, Kristian worked at the University of Oxford Future of Humanity Institute, researching global catastrophic risks. His new book, The Darwinian Trap, examines how our evolutionary wiring, these so-called Darwinian demons, drive behaviors that could undermine humanity's future. In this episode, we're exploring everything from the hidden forces shaping our decisions to the existential risks of technology and our fundamental need for global cooperation. Kristian brings a fresh and urgent perspective to the conversation on climate change and societal challenges, and he's got some revolutionary ideas on what it will take to truly evolve beyond our short-term impulses. By the end of this episode, you will not only understand these deeply ingrained patterns, but hopefully feel inspired to start recognizing them in your own life, and maybe even consider how we, collectively, can work toward a more sustainable future. Kristian, what a pleasure to connect. Welcome to the Superhumanize podcast.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Absolutely. Your work and your thought processes are nothing but intriguing. You recently published a fascinating book, The Darwinian Trap, and your work delves into how evolutionary traits that once were advantageous can or actually have become hindrances in our very fast-paced and complex world of today. And this concept of evolutionary mismatch, it sheds a light onto these sometimes subtle but very profound ways in which we're often hardwired to work against our own best interest in the modern era. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Darwinian Trap?
Yes. So the Darwinian Trap is essentially a trap that evolution and evolutionary selection pressures created for us. So the whole idea is quite simple. It's essentially like when you are an agent in any type of environment. So by an agent, I mean like a human or a cell or a nation state or a country. You have different selection pressures on you in order to succeed and survive over time. And those selection pressures can be very specific and very slim, to such an extent that you need to behave in a way that is against the interest of everyone around you and even against the interest of yourself. So to get a little bit of an intuition for the Darwinian trap, I can give you a couple of examples. And I can start with less dramatic examples and then build myself up towards the more dramatic and indeed existential examples. So I think a typical example that a lot of people can resonate to is that in your workplace, you might have colleagues that are incompetent. You see clearly that they're incompetent, but nonetheless, they are getting promoted. And one of those reasons can be that, typically speaking, what is selected for in the workplace is not necessarily talent. It is for your boss to like you, to actually give that promotion in the first place. And that is a metric that you can easily hack. You can go out with a boss, grab a beer, maybe suck up to them a little bit extra, be a little bit charismatic. And if you do all of those things, you will get the promotion and survive the game in the workplace. And we see those things all over the place. We indeed see them in social media as well. For instance, in order to survive as a social media company, you ideally want to maximize for user retention and profit. And why is that important? It's important because of the pay-per-click model of advertisement, where if people click more on your ads, you will be more successful as a business. The thing is, however, what social media companies have realized and indeed built into their algorithms is if they promote content that emotionally triggers you on the feed, then you're more likely to engage with that content. And that seemed to select for fake news or clickbaity headlines or outrageous things. So we have these selection pressures in our society. But as we walk up and talk about, for instance, global states and nation states, there seems to be a selection pressure to win the game of power. And that means getting more and more dangerous weapons over time, for instance. So in order to survive, you need to go from swords of bronze to swords of steel to bows and arrows to cannons to machine guns and eventually to nuclear weapons. And if you don't engage in that game of power, you're going to be selected away from just through normal selection pressures. The societies that tend to live in harmony with nature, that were not very expansive in nature, they're all gone because they were outgunned by societies that prioritized military technology more than anything else.
Yes.
That indeed creates a bit of a risk over time. So hopefully through those examples in many different levels of selection, from your own life to enterprises to nation states, these Darwinian traps or Darwinian demons, as I call them, exists and create all sorts of situations that are bad for our everyday life and can even threaten our very existence.
Thank you for this bird's eye view, Kristian. And given that many of these behaviors are extremely detrimental to our environment, to our societal stability, to peace on Earth, given that many of these behaviors are actually rooted in survival mechanisms, do you think there's a path for us humans to consciously override these ingrained patterns, or are we fundamentally constrained by them? Are we basically effed?
Yes, that's a really good question. Certainly, in some aspects, it seems like we're effed because we have nuclear power or we have nuclear weapons that can destroy the lives of 5 billion people and bomb us back to the Stone Ages. And that is all because of this global race for power. And we can also see this being very much built into nature. Everything from viruses to parasites to cancer cells are a manifestation of this trap. So then to the question, are we basically screwed because of it? I think what gives me hope, at least, is that when we look throughout nature, we have managed to solve all of those things in the past. I mean, from early RNA replicators, it turns out that actually short RNA molecules replicate a lot faster. But if you're really short, then you can't encode for genes. And we need to encode for genes to make complex life possible. But that was solved by basically probably these longer RNA chains collaborating with some sort of lipid membrane that created an inner environment where they could actually replicate and creating a protocell. But then when we had all of these cells floating around, viruses came as a new foe. But we solved that through the development of the CRISPR-Cas9 mechanism, where you could scissor away sort of these viruses from spreading. And cancer then became a new foe against multicellular organisms. But we developed a whole immune system against cancerous cells that are defecting against the will of the colony. And without those mechanisms, us, you and me, would not be possible. Everything that we take for granted in life, everything of beauty, everything of value is just layers and layers upon cooperation, which paints a very beautiful picture. And I think that gives me quite a bit of hope. And the fact that all of life is very intertwined. And in fact, and I present some ideas for that in my book, how you can utilize that to our advantage. But I think also that you can also make the opposite mistake of thinking, okay, because everything has been fine throughout the history of evolution, we will inevitably be fine in the future because life always finds a way to punish these defectors. And that's also something that I talked quite a bit in my book, that you can also fall to the other extreme where, either you think life is super, super stable and nothing can go wrong. And then you can have the other extreme view that we're totally effed. And I think I fall somewhere in between. And I would want to say that we're definitely in charge of our own destiny here. We can decide on which side of things we're gonna fall in the end.
I agree with you, Kristian. And I am somebody who is basically an incurable optimist. I very well see all of the challenges we're facing. I also believe in goodness and in life itself continuing. What you also just said, there's so many things pointing towards that. The human history as we know it is actually just a tiny fragment of actual human history. Just recently, or right now, they're uncovering this. They carbon dated a city that is covered by the ocean, the Indian Ocean, so somewhere in India, to 9,000 plus years. And it looks like the city was from a high culture. Then there's other things that pop up every once in a while where even scientists are saying human beings may have been around for hundreds of thousands, maybe for millions of years. So maybe we have effed ourselves up quite a lot of times over the course of history and somehow survive it and rebuild. I just hope that this time around, we don't screw ourselves up so totally that maybe 100,000 years from now, some of our offspring that survived and rebuilt finds remnants of our cultures. Maybe we've been around for much longer than we thought. Talking about this, what practical approaches could help our society, our culture right now, to not screw up massively and to bridge this evolutionary gap?
Yeah. I think we need to both somehow emotionally learn that we are a part of something much bigger than ourselves. And what I mean by that is we live in like these layers upon layers of cooperation and collaboration. And I am a colony, you are a colony, and that is absolutely wild. But similarly, nation states and enterprises are just collections of people. And what tends to happen is that you grow up and you think you're the center of the universe, and your ego is inflated. And to some extent, there is an evolutionary selection pressure for you to have some sort of ego. And I think it's because we're in this in-between state almost. Cells were once in that in-between state as well, where you have collaborative groups of cells, but they were not collaborative enough to be called an entirely new organism or unit of selection. And sometimes you had defectors in those groups of cells, and it probably oscillated a lot between cooperation and defection until the cooperation became stable enough for it to actually create this new superorganism that we call ourselves. But I think similarly, I think it is possible to make all life on Earth such a superorganism. And I think us humans have the capacity to do. We have this unprecedented ability to actually predict and try to predict the future and try to predict the consequences of our actions. And if the consequences of our actions are bad, we can govern them. We can govern them through legal systems or incentives and multiple different ways, where hopefully we can reach a state where we actually have stable cooperation on the global arena. But it has to be in a way where anarchy on the global arena in its current form doesn't exist. Because right now, there is no such thing as global law or order, or for that matter, norms. These norms tend to be broken all the time with invasions of foreign countries and genocides and so on and so forth. And there is nobody that can police that. So I think we need to build a hybrid governance mechanism. And I also talk about that in the book, where we try to build out the global governance structures that we have, where eventually like something like the UN could converge into something more like the EU or the United States, where there is actually a way to penalize defectors more than just using fancy words in the General Assembly chamber of the UN, but where you can actually do something concrete and tangible. But that's more of a centralized mechanism. I also think there is ways to leverage the fact that everything in our societies are so deeply interconnected through global supply chains and value chains that nobody can actually make it alone. Just the fact that we had, I think it was a bit more than a year and a half ago, this ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, and that just blocked all trade and had like trillions of dollars of consequences. That is just one example of how interconnected it is. And I think we can leverage that fact that we're all dependent on one another to create new systems of governance. And we can take the conversation in either which one of those directions.
Yes, absolutely. And we may even take it in both. What you just cited with the ship getting stuck, that of course affected people globally. We're just experiencing it on a smaller scale, yet a US-wide scale, with the 2 hurricanes we had on the East Coast and the devastation it caused in Florida. So one of our businesses is actually a longevity clinic and a mental health clinic. So we actually ran very short on IV bags, saline bags, because for the first time I realized that most of those come out of Florida. And we're not the only ones affected by it. This is a tiny little example how everything is connected, and why, yes, we should care what's happening at the other end of the country or the other end of the globe. So the one part of this, Kristian, is to actually understand our evolutionary impulses so we can actually counteract them more effectively when we look at a global scale, such as you've been talking about. So how can we actually translate this into an actionable change at a global policy level, especially areas like climate policy, where short-term thinking absolutely prevails? Can we actually incentivize governments and corporations to think beyond immediate so-called benefits?
Yeah, I think we can. And there's 2 ways of doing it. One is more centralized. So imagine, for instance, setting global policy for a bunch of countries at the same time through the UN will be extremely difficult. We're trying our best. I'm personally part of the Sweden's government delegation to the UN Climate Conference every year, and we try hard. Like, there's a lot of players that are trying hard. Contrast that with something like the European Union, for instance. On a UN level, there's no enforcement mechanisms. Like, you can break the rules and very little will happen. You can exit the Paris Agreement and very little can happen. But once the European Union says, okay, we are all go net zero, then every country within the European Union and every single company within the jurisdiction of the European Union need to fall in line. So it again highlights the importance of enforcement mechanisms where you actually penalize defectors in some way or another. And that's what's happening, for instance, now when Hungary doesn't play ball with the European Union. It has like real consequences to them. So that's a centralized way of doing things. The problem with that approach is that it's very slow. I think in the best of worlds, maybe something like the European Union can grow to a global scale, not necessarily just the European Union, but other unions like it. And maybe there will be a union of union at some point in time. But my worry is that the third world war would need to happen in between, because the European Union and also the UN was created as a direct result of the war and the terror that came from the Second World War and all of those deaths. So what can we then do in between? And I think something that wouldn't require a global war is more decentralized mechanisms, and decentralized mechanisms that are more based on reputation. So I built this idea of like almost building something similar to a global credit score. We all know credit scores. It's a score that measures your ability to essentially pay your loans. And they exist for individuals, but they also exist for countries and enterprises. And there's this part that are essential in the financial system. So whenever you lend money to someone, regardless if it's the World Bank or the IMF doing it to countries, or like a bank doing it to enterprises, they all check your credit score. So what if we created something similar to that, but instead of measuring your ability to pay, we would measure what impact you have on the world, like positive and negative. And some of your more educated listeners that are familiar with something called ESG scores would say that, oh, this sounds exactly like what ESG scores are trying to accomplish. A problem, however, with ESG scores, which is these ratings that are put on enterprises and are supposed to measure how good and bad they are for the world, is that they're very centralized. They're essentially not democratized. There's one central entity, either ISS or MSCI, and profit-driven enterprises that tweak the score in a particular way where they will be able to sell as much of their product as possible. So it's very static. So what I imagine instead is a more democratic score where we actually leverage the decentralized power of markets in something that I call reputational markets. So a reputational markets work almost similar to betting odds or normal prediction markets. So you might have seen these predictions of, okay, who's going to win the next global tennis tournament, or even who's going to win in the election, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. And the thing about these prediction markets is that you're actually rewarded for making correct predictions. But it doesn't matter that much for the world, whoever wins the next tennis or football tournament. But what if you could leverage the same mechanisms where you're actually rewarded for truthful predictions to make predictions about things that matters? For instance, make predictions about like BP, will they have a major oil spill in the next year, for instance? And if you have a prediction around that, then market participants might be incentivized to do like very deep research into how are they actually conducting their oil drilling. Because if you have more information and better information than other market participants in a prediction like that, you will essentially make a ton of money and outcompete everyone else. Similarly, if you're worried about AI risk, for instance, you could leverage these reputational markets to ask, for instance, okay, will, for instance, cause a major terrorist attack, or will their model be used to enable a major terrorism attack because they didn't safety test it enough? And for instance, like a prediction market or a reputational market like that could directly respond to new events happening. So for instance, if it turns out that a lot of safety researchers are leaving OpenAI and complain openly in the press about safety at the company, then that should affect the overall predictions of OpenAI doing harm over time. And similarly, for instance, if it turns out that BP is not doing enough testing or diligence in their oil drilling, and there is a report being leaked around that, then that would also affect sort of their reputation on these reputational markets. So that's a general idea, to create sort of more selection pressures for actually being good. And if you have a bad score, similar to when you have a bad credit score, like you're not going to get loans, people are not going to be willing to do business with you, people are not going to be willing to supply you with critical raw materials or buy your products, similar to how people actually use credit scores today to do due diligence on their suppliers and buyers and even employees.
That makes a lot of sense, Kristian. So from the policies and policing / reinforcing to these prediction models and having this kind of a credit score, I think that makes a lot of sense. There's another component, though, that I think is also very important, and that is, what would it actually take to reshape our values on a societal level to align with, for example, long-term ecological health? Are there any cultural or educational shifts as potentially being most effective in reprogramming this collective mindset?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there's multiple interventions that are needed. For instance, I think overall we need to reflect more about our values in general. And comes more from the personal reflection. I think a lot of us can identify with situations where you almost feel like you're multiple people at the same time. You might, for instance, decide that, I really like meat. I really like the taste of meat. But at the same time, you might actually be worried about the animals that you're indirectly hurting as a result. Yeah, a lot of people can identify with it.
I mainly plant-based. I didn't stop eating meat because I hated the texture and flavor. I always loved it, but I stopped eating it because of exactly, this is one of the main reasons, the animals, the ecological impact, the social justice impact, and so forth. But please go on. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people can identify with that sort of cognitive dissonance. And it all is based on the fact that you haven't fully defined what values do I want to follow as an individual. Because some people will end up saying, okay, I've made the decision now. Like, I think the taste and the texture is more important. For some people, that will not be the case, but a lot of people linger in between. So I have this concept in the book that I call the principles of value alignment. And the same principles can be applied to both yourself, or if you're a business, or for that matter, if you're a country or a larger organization. And the process is essentially like 3 steps. The first one is saying, what is it that I actually value here? And as an individual, it might turn out that what you value is friendship, or it might turn out that what you value is more like sort of utilitarian ethics. That's where I come from. What I want to maximize in life is the well-being of all sentient beings. And I came to that conclusion after a lot of philosophizing. But for instance, let's say you're a newspaper and you might end up feeling like, okay, we're actually doing a lot of harm. We have a lot of clickbaity headlines. What is it that we actually value? And maybe you agree that what we value is to hold power to account. Okay, that's great. Like, first step, you have defined your values. Then second step is, okay, what actions can we take in order to affect those values in a good direction? So in one step or one way of measuring it, if you're a media organization, could be like, okay, how many articles do we publish that are more investigative journalism? And you could have that as a success criteria, if you will. So now you have defined like what success means in accordance with those values. So that's step number 2. Then step number 3 is trying to incentivize a behavior that moves in the right direction. And that could, for instance, be like, okay, maybe we just need to change from a pay-per-click model to a subscription model where actually our readers will thank us for the investigative journalism and then subscribe to our paper, for instance. So that's the 3 steps of value alignment: to figure out what is it that you value, how do you measure that, and then how do you incentivize actions in that direction. And I think the beautiful thing about the idea of reputational markets is that you could potentially do all of those things decentralized. So you actually let people vote as global citizens. What is it that we actually value? Some people might vote that they value the lives of sentient beings such as myself. Others might vote that they value nature and spending a lot of time in nature and maybe nature for its own sake. Other might value health or other things. So first you vote on that as market participants. And then secondly, you measure the success criteria of businesses in relation to those values by placing those bets. For instance, I value nature, then I care about if BP has another oil spill. Like I value, I don't know, existential threats, and therefore I care about if OpenAI's next model is aligned and they safety tested it properly. And then third, you can also build in like the mechanism where you care about your reputation on those markets by, for instance, saying that your reputation, you get a bad reputation yourself if you don't sanction other people with a bad reputation. So in such a world, for instance, like NVIDIA might be incentivized to sanction OpenAI, because if they don't do, they will also get a bad reputation, and then they risk getting sanctioned by TSMC, the big chip manufacturer in Taiwan that they're dependent on to manufacture their chips. So I think we need to think more in terms of like, how do we build like the right mechanisms and incentive structures that like gives rise to the behavior that we want to see in ourselves, in our organizations and our workplaces and our countries and globally as well, in order to build a world that are free from these Darwinian traps and Darwinian demons.
Yes, absolutely, Kristian. And let's take this thought process to the global politics level, right? So today's world is so interconnected to solve problems like climate change or also resource scarcity. It requires unprecedented levels of global cooperation, but these evolutionary biases toward competition and in-group favoritism, they often inhibit this cooperation. It's really a paradox. We need to work together like never before, but we're inherently wired to resist it. So when we take what we've been talking about to the global politics stage, to global leaders, the people a lot of individuals look up to actually move things forward, to make things right. How can these global leaders overcome these so deeply embedded biases to foster a genuine collaboration or a feeling, a willingness for them on an international scale? Are there, if you would advise a world leader, let's say the president of the United States, or would you advise on very specific mechanisms or institutions, or maybe even how to inspire a majority of the population on what they would need to create to actually overcome this in-group biases?
Yeah, I think it has to start from the grassroots. Right now, there is a selection pressure for almost the opposite of what you're describing. It's a selection pressure for very self-centered, almost psychopathic behavior in global
Yes.
leadership positions.
Yes.
because you need to have a lot of confidence. You need to have a lot of confidence. You need to play the game in a way where you don't have any regrets when you backstab your political opponents. So right now, actually quite the opposite, where we seem to be selecting for the sort of almost psychopathic narcissists. And that is not to say that everyone is a psychopath. But if you look at it statistically, like I'm pretty darn certain that they're overrepresented in the global leadership positions compared to everyone else. And as long as we play along with that game, where we actually play favorites with politicians that are doing that type of stuff, because it's easy to get carried away with demagogues that have like very simple us versus them narrative. My political opponent is evil. They will destroy democracy as we know it. And we have heard that in so many elections right now, especially in the US. But the democracy is still there. The democracy was there after Obama, when the conservatives were saying, okay, there's going to be a communist takeover. They were there after Trump as well, when everyone was saying, okay, he will become and proclaim himself to be a global dictator and so on. And so we just play along in this game. And instead, I think, honestly, I would love a situation where we actually selected for people that are thoughtful, and if they go out and meditate, or maybe even dabble with something like ayahuasca, we would say, hey, this is actually like a positive thing. Like the fact that you have been on this journey of self-discovery where your ego is at least to some extent dissolved, and your preferences are aligned with the global good, not just what is best for yourself, okay, now you can have my vote. And I think until that happens, like, it will be very hard. And I think the best we can do until then is try to dabble with other types of mechanisms, like the reputational markets that I described, for instance.
Yes, that's thank you for this perspective, Kristian. And it resonates with me too. And it is truly fascinating fascinating is not even a good word for it, but like when you see a horrible car crash and you just can't help looking because our brains are also wired to look at the danger or something bad happening. When you watch all of these, not even second, not even third or fourth tier figures, because we don't get first and second tier, we don't get the best of the best who end up most of the times in global leading positions, because the best people often don't want to get into that game, or they don't have the funds or the connections to get into it. And yes, I would love to see leaders who have actually done the self-work, who've actually healed their trauma, who actually have seen and embrace and integrate their darkness, versus these children, hurt children in adult bodies, who then wield so much power and use this to further damage the world in so many different ways. So I like what you said about it needs to be grassroots. So obviously today we have tools at our disposal that may actually hopefully help this grassroots effort. You've also mentioned in your work how technology can either hinder or help collective efforts. And in your view, Kristian, can technology facilitate a kind of global empathy that transcends national and cultural boundaries?
I think it can. And again, like, there is an evolutionary mismatch here, because we're still ruled by the same fight or flight response. If someone says something about me that is a little bit critical, I might feel like, I need to defend myself. I need to punch back, instead of actually listening, seeing it as a learning opportunity, being a little bit relaxed. But similarly, you might go to attack against someone else. So if we didn't have such a well-attuned flight or flight response, that, by the way, was super adaptive back in the days, because if you were not liked by your group, and you started to be pushed out, then that was a death sentence back in the day, right? Or even you could encounter a tiger, you could encounter all sorts of dangerous things. So you had to have this flight or fight response. But today it leads to dysfunctional marriages and relationships and us electing dysfunctional politicians and so on. So like, I would love for us to invest for our own sake in like pharma research on how can we actually get around that evolutionary mismatch, because we no longer have a use for being on edge. We're just hurting ourselves and the people around us as a result. That's one thing where I think technology could solve by developing and doing more R&D in terms of what can the next generation of medications potentially do against it. And I think some people might hear that and it sounds like dystopian. Okay, are we going to forcibly drug all people in order for them to be kind and compliant? And that's not what I'm saying. That's not at all what I'm saying. Of course, it should be up to every single individual to do this. But if you have the opportunity, like, why not do it? I would love to have less anxiety in my life. I would love to be more receptive to kind and well-meaning criticism instead of being like on edge and trying to pick up a fight. That's obviously one mechanism. And the other one that I already described is like reputational markets, for instance. Information technology can enable the aggregation of global preferences and what we like and what we don't like. And we can, I think, and we probably should reform how global democracy operates, and with the help of technology as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And your thoughts on how technology can amplify both our strengths and also our weaknesses it's incredibly relevant, especially when we look at these rapid advancements, AI, bioengineering, digital connectivity. And I very clearly see how technology can be our savior or a tool for us becoming our own saviors, or also a tool for our downfall, very much influenced by how we actually steer it, right? Because what you put in is what's going to get put out, and oftentimes at a 10x. When we look at this double-edged nature of technology, what ethical guidelines or frameworks would you advocate for to ensure that innovation, especially as rapidly advancing as it is right now, what frameworks would you suggest that actually serve our long-term interests? And do you think are we actually capable of implementing such measures before these technologies run out of our control?
Yeah, that is the trillion-dollar question, right? And I think we're probably going to be alive to see which one of those outcomes it will be. Like, will it be the outcome where we can actually create a much better society, or will it be the outcome that leads to our destruction? I think that will probably be within our lifetime, which is in some ways terrifying. And to answer that question, what should we think about? I think the most important thing is to remember in what contexts and incentive structures a technology is actually being deployed. I feel like a lot of Silicon Valley has been illiterate when it comes to incentives and incentive structures, because you're only analyzing the technology in and of itself, and you're only looking at the positive potential of the technology. So take something like social media, for instance. Like, we had a very positive outlook on social media 10 or 15 years ago. There was this talk about it actually creating global democracy, where everyone would be interconnected in the world, it would be impossible for any dictator to hide. And fast forward 15 years later, social media is actually being used by the dictators to cement their dictatorship. So what went wrong here between the expectations and the outcomes that actually happened? And I think what went wrong was a disregard for the incentives in which the technology was deployed. And what I mean by that specifically is the per click model for social media. So of course it could have led to global democracy, but in order to monetize it, social media companies had to implement the pay per click model. And there they realized that actually the best way to get paid is through the invention of the feed, where all of a sudden people are not creators of content, they're consumers of content in endless doomsday scrolling. And in endless doomsday scrolling, where the most outrageous headlines are going to win. They don't have to be true. They just have to emotionally trigger you to stay active on the platform. So that's what went wrong. And we lost that battle. But we're now about to repeat the same mistake with artificial intelligence, which is frightening. That was AI 0.1. We're now coming to AI like 1.0, where they're truly becoming as intelligent as human beings with only just a couple of years. And so we need to think about in what incentive structures are these artificial intelligence being deployed. And they're deployed in an incentive structure that is profit maximizing for enterprises and power maximizing for countries. So even if we figure out how to build like intelligent agents that are beneficial for all humankind, and that's a big if, we have no ideas of how to solve the alignment problem at the moment. But even if we do, will markets select those agents? As an enterprise CEO, do you want to select the hippie agents that want to like maximize values for all sentient beings? Or are you actually legally obliged to select the agent that maximizes the profit of your enterprise regardless of the consequences? And likewise, like if you're the military leadership of Russia or Israel or Ukraine, do you want to implement an AI that cares about human rights above everything else? Or do you want to implement an AI that will make you win the war in the end of the day? So we cannot be illiterate to the incentive structures in which we deploy technologies. We already lost once because of it. And now the stakes are astronomical. So we cannot repeat the same mistake again.
Yes, Kristian, 100%. And these are profound questions that should be discussed on much broader forums daily. Unfortunately, this is not what we're getting littered with on our social media feed. How do you view your own role or also the role of your organization, Normative, in equipping individuals, leaders, as well as corporations with this knowledge to actually identify and avoid these mistakes, these traps? Could there, for example, be a standardized approach for companies to conduct self-assessments or audits of their decision-making processes to mitigate these short-term biases? And the same again for how do you see what is your role in this and your organization's role?
Yes. So basically what we do at Normative is that we do carbon emissions accounting and management. And the name Normative is actually derived from normative ethics, which is a branch of ethics that is concerned with what you ought to do. What do you ought to do in order to live like a moral and ethical life? And so the scope of Normative has always been that, for me, it has been a way starting that business with my co-founders to figure out, like, can we actually utilize the power of these value chains and supply chains to create incentives that will spread throughout the entire system? So for carbon emissions specifically, the way we do it is that, okay, as a large enterprise, you might have a net zero target, and you have nowadays actually mandatory compliance pressure to report on your emissions. But your emissions will be dependent on the emissions of your supplier, and the emissions of your supplier will be dependent on the emissions of their sub-supplier. So we built this thing called the carbon network, where you can actually ask your supplier, the supplier can ask their supplier, and so on and so forth, to actually reduce their carbon emissions. And the thing is that we see that it's working, like it's actually working. We see these network effects where businesses are actually starting to care. Obviously, we would have loved for it to go a lot faster. But I think this is a model that can be replicated in other domains as well. So for instance, if you're worried about artificial intelligence, like one way to govern it is by looking at the supply chain. In order to build a large AI model, you need a bunch of computer chips. So if you're OpenAI, NVIDIA needs to deliver those chips. But NVIDIA, they need to have those chips manufactured somewhere. So they need to collaborate with TSMC. TSMC cannot create those chips without their lithography machines from the Netherlands. And they cannot collaborate without the optics from Carl Zeiss in Germany. So you have all of these interdependencies. So if you can actually have transparency in those value chains, you can use those interdependencies between enterprises to govern risks, regardless if it's risks of engineered pandemics or nuclear weapons for that matter, or dangerous AI or climate change. I think we hopefully have stumbled upon something that you can actually replicate in other domains as well. If there are other entrepreneurs listening, like I think there is many opportunities to start new startups in other domains of supply chain governance to avoid these global catastrophic risks.
Wonderful, Kristian. I'm so grateful for this truly fascinating, thought-provoking, and illuminating conversation with you. For people, entrepreneurs or other, who would like to learn more about you or also get in touch, where can they find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Kristian Rönn. They can also send me an email at christian@normative.io. And yeah, if you haven't read my book, The Darwinian Trap, already, I can highly recommend it. I'm also highly biased. This book is my baby, but would love to hear your feedback and input, both positive and negative. I think we all want to make and create a better world together.
Yes, yes. I'm with you, Kristian. And I'm very grateful for your time. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot for having me.